select crowd today. I just want to make one announcement and then introduce our speaker. The announcement is that this afternoon, precisely in this room at 5 p.m., we will have Eduardo Santana from the Universidad de Guadalajara, who will be speaking on the Museum for Environmental Science project in Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico. Eduardo, some of you may know, he's a BS and MA and PhD graduate of Wisconsin, and we've had him around for many, many years. And I would encourage you all to come and listen to him. It's a really interesting project. But today, the limelight is on our speaker, Francisco Pilotti. Yes. Absolutely. And he received in 1972, which was the year of my graduation, a licenciatura degree in sociology from the Universidad de Chile. In 77, he completed graduate studies in sociology and demography at Fordham University, New York. Completed later on 2 graduate studies in social anthropology at the State University of New York in Stony Brook. Francisco has taught at the University of Chile, at CUNY, at the Universidad Diego Portales, and at Clemson University. He's been a social planner in Chile's Children's Bureau, has been a consultant to UNICEF and ECLAC of the United Nations, and from 1987 to just last year, for 15 years, he was a staff member of the Organization of the American States, having served as head of Social Affairs Division in the Inter-American Children's Institute, director of the Department of Social Development, and Deputy Executive Secretary for Integral Development. So all these things that are now very much on the front burner in international work. He's been at the forefront of a lot of it. Today's topic is South-South Cooperation in Social Policy, the case of the Inter-American Social Protection Network. Please help me welcome Francisco.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Francisco, for the welcome. You did say that I did quite a few things, and if you start adding up those years, it's unfortunate that you might come up with my age, maybe. So anyway, and thank Lassis and thank all of you for being here today. And today's short talk will be about South-South Cooperation in Social Policy. And this is a rather new phenomenon in the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. There has been, of course, cooperation in social policy for a long time. But for the most part, it was very much project-centered, project-led. Whereas now it's more of a broader social policy kind of a concern that involves governments, countries, unlike before when it was more, again, an NGO kind of interest in minute but important, of course, projects dealing with, for instance, street children and other issues like that. Whereas now, again, I insist, I underline, it's more of the global policy orientation that is taking place in the region. And I will, at different points, use the example of the Inter-American Social Protection Network, which is a cooperation mechanism that is sponsored by the Organization of American States, and which I was pretty much involved during the past years since its inauguration in 2009 until early this year. So let me first start by giving a brief summary of the main topics that I will be dealing with today. First, refer to what I label there the social protection boom in Latin America and the Caribbean. So when we're speaking of social policy, it's really a very unique set of policies that has been labeled social protection. And this has been, again, like I say, quite a boom in the past 10, 13 years in the region. And then what follows after that is, of course, what are the factors that explain this rapid diffusion in practically all of Latin America and the Caribbean of this innovative social policy, which is again social protection. And look specifically at the role of cooperation in this process, in this diffusion process. And like I said, using as an example the ISPN. The last point is something of a reflection that I want to share with you. It's an issue that I and some colleagues are beginning to analyze, and it refers to the fact that what we've seen as we do research and get involved in cooperation is that several countries, a few of them, are actively involved now in introducing their successful social policy into their foreign aid policy. So this is a very unique also phenomenon that is occurring at present in the region. And let's start then by this social protection boom. And it's a set of policies, social protection, aimed at lowering poverty and inequality. Like I said, poverty and inequality have been the main concerns of development in Latin America for decades. But the very unique aspect of social protection is that it takes a more integral view, unlike before when it was very much different set of programs, now it's a more integral kind of perspective. And we will see also that some of the flagship programs are very well known at this point and discussed, such as the conditional cash transfers, which probably you've heard about in Brazil, in Bolsa Familia, and in the case of Mexico, for instance, Progresa. Another unique aspect of this boom is that the landscape, the institutional landscape in Latin America is changing very quickly. And what you have now is in practically all of the countries, particularly in South America, you have ministries of social development. I mean, these did not exist before. They've been a recent creation. It started with Sedesol, la Secretaría de Desarrollo Social in Mexico in the mid-90s. And then in the 2000s, really, they expanded throughout the whole of the region. And social protection is also at this point actively promoted by the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, and especially the World Bank. It's very active in this area, as well as different UN agencies such as UNICEF, ILO, World Health Organization, and ECLAC with headquarters in Santiago, Chile. So here you have then some of the main aspects and factors that explain this, again, boom in interest in social protection. And like I said, conditional cash transfer programs are perhaps the flagship programs of this social protection boom. Of course, they're not the only program. There are many others, but these are definitely the ones that are best known. And they consist, to say very briefly, in cash transfers to families living in extreme poverty, but provided that they comply with certain conditions that they have committed themselves to, and which have to do with the human capital of their children. So these families then, in exchange for that transfer, they commit themselves to meeting their children's needs in education by enrolling them in school and seeing to it that they continue attending school, and health and nutrition aspects, like, for instance, go to the health clinics and comply with vaccination schedules that are in force in the different countries. They were pioneered, these CCTs, in Brazil and Mexico in the late 90s. And again, as I mentioned, Bolsa Familia, which was known as Bolsa Escola initially, but then when it went to scale at a national level, and it included other features, it became Bolsa Familia with the Lula government. And in the case of Mexico, the same thing. It started with Progresa, and later on, during the government of Fox, it became a broader program, a nationwide program called Oportunidades. And and then after these pioneer experiences, they were rapidly implemented in most of Latin American countries and beyond. So this is a unique Latin America policy that has been then copied elsewhere, in particular in parts of Asia, Africa, and interestingly, even in New York City. New York City has a program called Opportunity NYC, which is part of the Mayor Bloomberg's efforts also to combat and attack poverty in the city. And they implemented a program based on Oportunidades, on the Mexican Oportunidades program. So as you can see, the CCTs really have become a very popular, widespread, worldwide phenomenon. And here you see the expansion of CCTs in Latin America starting in the mid to late 90s, up to 2011 in this case. And from a very few pioneer programs, in 2011 there were approximately 19 countries they had these CCTs. In terms of the coverage and investment in these CCTs, you can see that starting in 2000, basically they affected up to close to 6% of the total population of Latin America. And by the year 2010, it affected slightly over 19% of the total population. In absolute numbers, this, according to the ECLAC, is 113 million people. So 113 million persons in the region then are one way or another affected, participating in these programs. And in terms of the investment in the CCTs, they're cheap. That's another reason also why they're popular. In the year 2000, they accounted for a very minute part of GDP. And in 2009, it's still less than 0.5% of GDP. So really, they're rather cheap, and the coverage is again quite significant. And so these are the points that I'm going to be looking at now for the remainder of the presentation separately. And the question is, what explains this rapid expansion of CCTs? And of course, the first aspect to look at is that there has to be a receptive domestic environment. I mean, there have to be in place governments and institutions that clearly have an interest, a political interest, in implementing, in putting in place these programs. So for many authors, and in particular Nancy Birdsall and Nora Lustig, they pointed out first that the fact that the countries in Latin America returned to democracy in the 90s, all of them, after a long period of dictatorship, is the basic backdrop that one has to understand as a positive one for social protection and CCTs in particular. After a long spell of restructuring the economies of the region after the debt crisis of the 80s, there was a great deal of what authors call a social debt. In other words, inequality and poverty really had raised to high levels, particularly in the 1980s, which is called the lost decade. Instead of having decreased poverty, which was an ongoing effort in the past, poverty increased significantly during the 80s. So when democracy is back, of course, there are many groups that are legitimately claiming for a bettering of their situation. And so that provides, again, a very receptive environment for these kind of programs. But also Birdsall and Lustig and many other authors point out to an interesting fact that takes place in particularly after the year 2000, and is the fact that in more or less 10 countries of the region, what you have is left in general, broadly speaking, left regimes in the countries, in many of the countries in Latin America. They go on to distinguish between these left governments. And Lustig and Bertzel speak of what they label a populist left, mainly meaning that fiscally they're not as prudent perhaps as what the Washington Consensus was advising, and at the same time are more willing and eager to expand the state in different areas of the economy and in social policy. And this they contrast with what they label the social democratic left. And for them, an example of that is Chile and Brazil. An example of a populist left is Venezuela and Argentina. So what they go on to, and we're going to see that, to analyze is what impact does this new left, both the populist left and the social democratic left, have in terms of the social policies that they've implemented. And we'll also look briefly at favorable, what I label there a favorable international environment for social policy diffusion. And one of the interesting things is, of course, the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, which really have provided a roadmap for most countries in the world, but in particular Latin America, in terms of the aims, where they need to go, in particular MDG number 1, which calls for cutting in half the amount of people in extreme poverty by the year 2015. And many international organizations have gone beyond what used to be the traditional technical assistance of the past, which was mainly a top-down kind of expert visiting the country and giving more or less a recipe for a successful program. Now, more than that, it's trying to establish epistemic communities whereby the countries are able to share their experiences and shares the lessons learned both in their failures and successes, so that each country can then implement a program that is really tailored to their particular needs. And one example of that is, like I said, the OAS's ISPN. And the last point is this proactive foreign policy that we are beginning to see in some of the Latin American countries. Not all, but in a few of them. So going back to the first point, the favorable political environment in the countries. And Bertzel and Lustig, and this is of course very old, but the point of this is to show that as these social protection programs were being implemented, and in particular CCTs, what you had in Latin America is that around 10 countries had elected governments that could be labeled, again, broadly speaking, left-leaning. There have been, of course, changes, and in particular, in the case of Chile, now there is a government which is to the right, but which is coming to an end in a couple of months, and the same in the case of Paraguay. The remaining countries have really remained to the left, even though, of course, Kirchner is no longer the president of Argentina, but Cristina Kirchner is and follows the same line as her husband. The same with Hugo Chavez, Maduro now, which of course is following that same route. So this is an interesting, again, aspect of the politics in Latin America in the decade of the year 2000 and on. And like I said, these authors, Lustig and Bertzel, they make a distinction between the social democratic left, Chile and Brazil, and what they label the populist left of Venezuela and Argentina. And they go on to compare the public spending on social programs as a percent of GDP in education, health, and the transfers such as CCTs. And what they find is that for all of Latin America, this is more or less the percent of the GDP that they spend on social programs. In the year 2008, 2007, averaging around 14%. But interestingly, in the case of Argentina and Venezuela, as well as Chile and Brazil, they're above this average and are spending more than on their social programs. And those that are not on the left and are more, let's say, on the center or the right, are the ones that spend the least in social programs. But they're quick to point also, Bertzal and Lustig, that the social democratic ones, Chile and Brazil again, are the ones that really are at the top of this effort to provide more funding for social programs. And the same authors, viewing it from another perspective, in this case, the redistributive impact of the social spending, they see that again, the social democratic, Chile and Brazil, let's say, take a considerable amount of resources, in this case from the upper quintile of the richer inhabitants of their countries, and redistribute them mainly to the quintiles that are located in the lower end. And for all practical purposes, neglect quite an extent what we could label maybe an upper middle class. And this again is in sharp contrast with the rest of the countries labeled as populist left and center right, which take less from the richer segment of the population and obviously redistribute less to the other sectors of the population. So let's look now at the favorable international environment. We now have said that there was, in general, a receptive domestic environment in terms of politics, particularly in places like Chile and Brazil. And now let's look briefly at this international environment. And so this Inter-American Social Protection Network, some of the background and mandates. And being within the Organization of American States, where all countries are represented, Canada and the US, the Caribbean, of course, South America, Central America. But there was an interesting challenge back then, and it was the ALBA. The ALBA group, basically led by Venezuela and Hugo Chavez, which managed to, at one point, have close to 10 countries that were part of that initiative, La Alianza Bolivariana para los Pueblos de Norteamérica, which basically was set up in response, in a critical response to the US-led OAS set of countries. So you have countries like Ecuador, Bolivia, Nicaragua, several countries from the Caribbean, Bolivia, which are part of the ALBA. And in the 5th Summit of the Americas, which was held in Trinidad and Tobago in 2009, in April of 2009, was a very interesting moment there, politically speaking, because it was Obama had just recently taken office a few months earlier. So this was his first meeting face-to-face with the leaders of the Americas. And Chavez was, of course, there. They made quite a bit, the press at least, of the meeting between Chavez and Obama. And there was great expectation also at the same time in terms of what Obama's message was in terms of what his offer was for Latin America. And in general, there was quite, I would say, a frustration in terms of that it was very little that he offered aside from equal partnerships, but really with no very concrete examples of what that really meant. And on the other hand, you had again this ALBA challenge led by Venezuela, really trying to have countries really join a more Latin American kind of movement with their own, in the future, bank, instead of the IDB, have their own bank with resources provided mainly by Venezuela's oil-based wealth. So, to some extent, an interesting response on the part of the United States was, let's create an inter-American social protection network so that we can take the lessons learned from this social democratic left, which in many aspects is close to the US. The case of Chile, the case of Brazil, for instance, even though they have their own independence, they have their own foreign policies, of course, but to a great extent, it's really what the US feels comfortable in terms of promoting. So the idea that came up at the Fifth Summit of the Americas, particularly on the part of Hillary Clinton, was in order to comply with the Millennium Development Goals, especially in reducing poverty, the U.S. will support the creation of an inter-American social protection network in order to enhance and facilitate the exchange of good practices and knowledge between the countries of the region. At the same time, this took on a more practical and specific orientation in meetings that are also sponsored by the OAS of the ministers of these new social development ministries that I mentioned before had recently come up in the region, and they found their first forum at the OAS in a meeting in Chile in 2008, and that's where the Social Protection Initiative came up and was taken up by the U.S. at the Fifth Summit, and then later on a meeting in 2010 in Cali, Colombia.